Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Interrupted. This is your host, Conor Bronsdon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by a fellow podcast host, and that is Charles Max Wood, CEO of Top End Devs. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks.
Great to have you here. As I noted, you're a podcaster yourself, and not just for one show like us, you are part of several. Through Top End Devs, you host podcasts reaching over 70,000 developers each week. So I'm excited to get some of the benefit of your input since you talk with so many engineering leaders. Many of your shows focus on the ins and outs of a particular programming language like JavaScript Jabber or Angular or the specifics of iOS development. And you've been at it for over a decade now. So you've interviewed what, hundreds, maybe thousands of engineers and engineering leaders at that time?
Yeah, we've produced like 4,000, 4,500 podcast episodes over the last 13 years, 14 years, something like that.
So to say you've done a few would be an understatement. Um,
Yeah.
and you said something really interesting before the show started that I want to start off with. You said people are looking at the broad scope of tech today, and with so much new tech coming out, they're kind of struggling how to know how to stay current. What's your advice as someone who, you've been around for a decade, you've seen these changes happening, you've talked to so many folks. How would you suggest developers uh, apply a framework to help them make that decision?
Right. So I do have a framework for this, but just in kind of broad terms, yeah, I talk to people and they're seeing, just to name a few things in the current space, right? In web development, they're looking at Core Web Vitals from Google, or they're looking at just performance in general. Core Web Vitals is a set of performance metrics, but you also got new frameworks or new versions of frameworks or new tools or I think the latest hype thing was the stuff that came out of what's the name of the stack? Ryan Carniato put it out, Solid Stack, right? Where
Mm.
you had the um, different ways of updating state on your web pages and things like that. And so, yeah, it's all of these things, right? And then you've got tools, and new tools are coming out, new ways of hosting things. And anyway, it gets pretty overwhelming pretty fast because you feel like you have to be an expert in all of the things. And even if you're just focused on one stack, there's still stuff coming your way all the time. And so it's tricky. It's really tricky to know what to do. So what I recommend people do just to stay current, there are a couple of things. One is that if you can go to a local meetup, a lot of times just talking to other people will help you be able to prioritize the things that you need to learn. And I give people the advice that you don't have to know everything, right? You don't have to learn everything. You just have to learn the relevant things for the next thing that matters, right? And then you can continue to do that. And so it's kind of a blend of what am I working on now and where is my career going to take me, or where do I want my career to take me, and what do I have to learn in order there, right? So some of the stuff you're going to keep current on is going to be, yeah, tech stacks, tech tools, things like that. But maybe you want to go management track someday. So some of it's also going to be like leadership, communication, stuff like that. And I recommend that people blend it. But yeah, the framework effectively comes from, I read a book by Russell Brunson called .com Secrets. I think it's in that one. Um, and
I'll
he
check
talks
that
about
out.
the Dream 100. And what the Dream 100 is it's who are the 100 people that I need to be paying attention to, or that are talking about the stuff that's relevant to me. And then what I do is I take that, and most media outlets these days have some kind of RSS feed. YouTube actually does as well. And so I've been using a tool called Content Studio, which is actually made for you to ingest a whole bunch of stories and then share them to social media. I just don't use the share them to social media piece. And then I go through and I pick the things that look like they are trends, and I'm able to generally pick out, okay, we need to be talking about these things. And then I line people up on the podcast for them, which is another way of doing it. But you can add the podcasts in because podcasts run on an RSS feed. Um, and that's mostly the way that things go for that. But yeah, at the end of the day, that's one way at least of seeing what news stories and things like that are coming out, is by doing that and signing up for newsletters and stuff like that that give you lists of articles and things like that.
And given how extensively you read and explore this space, I absolutely want to talk about future trends that you're seeing and do some forecasting. But before we get there, I want to understand more about your perspective on how this kind of a framework and the approach devs have to take to stay current has changed over the last several years. Yes, there are more tools today than ever that people can leverage for their advantage, but it also means there's this breadth of knowledge that folks feel compelled to go after. Do you think developers are struggling in a way that they weren't, say, 10 years ago to actually consume knowledge and stay current?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that have made the difference there. Um, One of the major ways that they're struggling in ways that they weren't 10 years ago, let's say, or 5 years ago, is that, and I mentioned meetups to begin with, a lot of those kinds of things slowed down or stopped during COVID. And
Totally.
so, there weren't as many conferences or meetups or things like that. And so that made it harder to just see people out there talking about the technologies. And and so just our ability to connect as a community has really suffered. And I'd like to see that change back a bit, but it seems like people aren't as willing to go out of their way to create those situations. And so I'm working on doing that as much as I can with top end devs. But I haven't cracked that particular nut either. The other thing that's different is that depending on the community that people are in, so I tend to spend most of my time in the Ruby community and the JavaScript community. And with the Ruby community, the the rate of innovation and things like that, that you have to stay current on is much slower. Things have stabilized to the point where staying current on Ruby stuff is not terribly hard, right? And so then it's just the minor updates and things like that that come out to some of the things that we've used for a long time that we update people on that, and then you have the occasional major change to things, right? And so you have a new, like, they came out earlier this year with a new deployment library for Ruby on Rails, and and so yeah, that was worth talking about for a little while, right? Um, but like the JavaScript community is different, and I remember when Node.js was brand new, right? It was a new innovation every other week. And, there was
It's
a
a little
lot to
different
keep
now.
up on. But the rate of change was, it was frequent and it was fast and it was fun because it was all new stuff. And what we've seen is we've seen JavaScript grow into more and more and more areas and take on more and more and more concerns. And so if you're in the JavaScript world these days, trying to stay up, even if you just focus on React or Angular or Vue, there's still a much wider breadth of things to keep track of now than there were back then. And it hasn't slowed down a ton, right? And you have bleed over between these different ideas. And so at the end of the day, you wind up with these situations where there's a lot of change in a lot of places, and it's just really hard to keep up with. And then all of the frameworks adopt it, but you kind of want to understand the history of it and understand, what Ryan was coming up with when he invented it. And, he invented it based on some of these other ideas. I had a long conversation with him at a conference about it. And so anyway, so you get these things that come out. And so then it's okay, how do I stay up on that and how it's changing and how people are adopting it here, there, and wherever. And so anyway, it's just it's a lot. And
So you think
so
the rise of AI enabled tooling like, I mean, just using ChatGPT Basic or Copilot, other tools will help kind of fill that gap of where folks are like, hey, I can't have the breadth of knowledge on all this stuff. Let me focus my area and be really good at, prompt engineering for certain pieces.
maybe I don't know that it's going to replace things in this particular area of concern, right? It's not going to substitute for my knowledge of what the latest thing is. But what I have seen is seen these AI tools make up for sort of the common regular things that I need to work on or replace or
Let you
be able
specialize
to do.
more.
Right. And so when I use them, what happens is I'm more efficient in these areas. And so then I can go and learn the state of the art things that are coming down the pipe in other areas. And so it may help with some of this, but it's not going to keep me current. It's just going to serve as a tool for me to more easily and effectively do what I'm already doing.
Right. And so then you still have to make the effort to apply that framework or seek
Right.
that
But
meetup or dive deeper.
right. But I may be able to get more done and then spend the time, spend the time that I gained back to stay on top of what's out there.
So, what trends do you see coming then? You're someone who's very on top of what's happening lately. Obviously, you're paying attention to these tools. What's coming from the industry as a whole and for developers as far as the next thing they need to be aware of?
Right. It's kind of tricky to pick those out. Like sometimes it's obvious, like, hey, we're all moving toward, whatever. But in other cases it's not so obvious, right? And so sometimes what we'll see is we'll see a trend toward um in a lot of cases we're seeing things move back toward more performant, less stateful web development, for example, in JavaScript. Um, I but you also see other things come up where they kind of you get more meta frameworks. That's something that we're seeing a lot more of these days in JavaScript, where you have a framework that's built on top of another framework. So you've got React, and then you've got like Redwood JS or Next.js or some of these others that, fully utilize React, but also use other tools to either provide a back end, or that's what Redwood JS does, right? It uses Prisma and your database tools to give you a JavaScript backend. You've got, other systems that do some of those other things. I think a lot of the trends these days that I'm seeing are happening in tooling too, right? So you
Definitely.
mentioned the AI tooling. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. In fact, I think that's going to become more of a thing where um, a lot of the common problems that I'm going to run into are going to be solvable by AI. But then it creates a new problem, right? That may create a new trend, right? Because if it's handling all of the stuff that I would generally hand off to a junior developer, then where do I get the next crop of senior developers, right?
Right. Are they going to be able to learn enough
Right,
experientially by solving these problems? And I
right.
think there's also going to be another trend around enterprises saying, okay, can I trust this AI enabled code and what's the impact of it? And
Mhm.
so there's a lot that's going to be happening there. I think
Yeah.
2024 will see way more of that. I mean, obviously, we're just seeing increasing investment.
Mhm.
It's pretty clear that's going
Yeah.
that way.
If I have to call out a couple of trends that I think are going to come hard and fast, I think the number one is going to be integration of more AI in programming. And it's not just going to be AI tools, it's going to be AI parts of your back end, and the need to understand the different models and how they're used and how to uh, use your data and fit your data to what you're doing without overfitting, so that you get good results on a regular basis. I think people are going to need to understand AI much better going forward, and that's probably in my head a 3 to 5 year trend that we're going to see. It's going to become much more of a thing, a much more immediate thing. I think within the next year or two, I think we're going to see a huge uptick in the need for people to understand security. Um,
Absolutely. I mean,
and
that's been ongoing, right? But it feels like it's accelerating.
it's been ongoing, but it's going to get worse. And the other way that it gets worse is that I can see applications of AI to get past security openings in programs. And
Oh, definitely.
so I definitely see that, and I'm very comfortable calling that. Um, I kind of have the sense that there's something out there waiting for its moment to happen in more distributed systems, um, or distributed apps is what people are calling them. They usually use blockchain technologies with those.
Right.
I don't know what the killer app is, but I have a feeling that something's coming. I just don't know when or what.
Yeah, I mean, we're
And
seeing
that's
distributed ledgers get used in like supply chain and
yeah,
these different areas already, but I agree with you. Like, what's going to be the thing that kind of hits public
yeah.
consciousness? And I'm not sure.
I think that's going to come within 10 years. I don't know if it's going to be next year or in 10 years, but I feel like that's coming. But honestly, I'm very, very comfortable with the idea of AI permeating a lot more things. right? And not just
Absolutely.
because it's trendy, but also because it's effective and useful. And then on the other end of it, the security stuff. And then finally, I think we're going to see a lot more movement in the infrastructure as code, platform engineering space.
Yeah, that's been a huge
And
thing for us this year that we've seen. No question.
yeah, absolutely. But just looking at the state of things with like Kubernetes and Helm and Docker and all of the tools people use now, there is so much rich ground to plumb, and people are plumbing it. And so, yeah, I think we're going to look at things the way they are now in a few years, and we're going to be like, man, we've come a long way.
Yeah, it feels like I'll say DevOps in particular is really evolving
Yeah.
currently, where like that next stage of tooling and how all these development processes work and how tooling interacts
hmm
together is it's clear that we're on a cusp of a major change, and we're starting to see those trends already. To your point,
Yeah, I think of DevOps more like agile, and then platform engineering is more the technical end of that.
I agree.
Um, And so I think there's going to be more crossover with the way we work within DevOps, but I think a lot of those principles have really been explored deeply. And I don't know that that changes so much as just it fuels the way that we think about
Yeah,
our
the
infrastructure.
tooling end though is I think to your point
Yeah.
where we're going to see this massive change
Yeah.
because I
The
mean
way we work is going to change.
yeah. But it feels like that focus has been a lot on like process, right? On like, hey,
hmm
how do we communicate? How do we, break up teams into different smaller units and have them interact? And now we're saying, okay, now that we've done a lot of that work, let's jump back in and say, how do we fix all these tooling issues that are evolving, especially now that we're bringing AI into our code, kind of adding
Right.
all these different efficiency metric pieces.
Yeah. And we may see some crossover with platform and AI, right? So AI
Totally.
is designing our infrastructure. I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think we've been going into the ways that we communicate between teams or embed DevOps into our dev teams or ops teams. We've been talking about that since the Agile Manifesto and before. So I think that's just going to continue on whatever slow burn it's on.
Yeah.
I think the change is going to come in the tooling.
I feel like and I could be off on this, but in let's say 3 years, once we've seen this kind of burst in platform engineering changes and the kind of platform tools, maybe we'll kind of see a reignition of that. Hey, are these processes around it right? But it,
Mhm.
it definitely feels like the area of focus now is how are the tooling interacting? Like, what do we need to do on the infrastructure side? Infrastructure as code, as you pointed out, and like really making like programmable workflows that have high degrees of customization for companies.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm sure we'll figure out, 2, 3 years down the line, once we've explored AI in that area more and kind of have these tools in place, we'll go, oh, actually, we have to rethink this process now because
Yeah.
we're using AI for, 25% of our code, 30, 40% of our code, who knows? Um, yeah,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we saw just the differences in programming languages that we had in the 2000s versus the 90s versus the 80s necessitated a lot of this, where we started talking about agile teams and extreme programming and stuff like that. So I could definitely see that as a natural outgrowth of things, right? Where before it was mainframe programming and you'd have one guy go squirrel away for a year and come back with your mainframe code,
yeah.
right? It just got to the point where computers were so efficient that we needed a team to design the system that went onto the server. And then now we're to the point where, yeah, we're building out entire infrastructures in our code. And, that's so we talked about it again, came up with DevOps. And so, yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Do you see the programming languages we use today rapidly changing here the next few years as well as AI starts to take certain burdens off us or kind of do some of that grunt work, as you said?
Maybe I, if I had to guess on any of that, honestly, my inclination, and we've already seen this to a certain degree, is that they will change to accommodate more of the kinds of problems that AI solves. And
Mm,
so, um, right now, a lot of these things are written in Python. Um, I could see languages evolving so that they're much more concurrent. They can take care of, they can handle multiple cores better. They, solve a certain class of problems better. I could see hardware picking up some of the slack on some of that. And so then your languages take advantage of the hardware, chip design stuff. And, and so we may evolve into a world like that. Um, I don't foresee languages. I guess languages could start taking advantage of AI type features, right? But I don't think they'll fundamentally change so much as just maybe add new language features in that allow the AI to take advantage of them,
It's more
right?
about
Somebody
enabling
could
versus
sit down
wholesale
and,
change.
yeah, they'll enable themselves as opposed to change what they already have. Because it's hard to give up backward compatibility unless you have a really compelling reason. And I don't know if that's compelling enough.
So this brings up an interesting point. We're going to see all this change in tooling. We're going to see potentially languages adjusting themselves to fit these new realities. I have some clear trends we expect. What career advice would you give to engineers who want to stay current and maybe learn a new skill or learn a new language over the next couple of years?
Right. So most of it, and I've been talking to people, I've been coaching people on a lot of this stuff where, yeah, they're not sure where to go next. They're not sure, what kind of those steps look like, right? So, um, and it's tricky too, right? Because if I'm working for a company that's using current technology, which they all are, right? I do need to gain a certain level of expertise in that. That's not the future looking thing, right? It's just the, hey, I've got to get my job done thing.
Sure.
And so I tell people to spend at least 20 or 30% of their time that they spend learning stuff, learning things that point to the future. And the thing is that even if you don't know off the top of your head what's going to come next, you can still see some of these trends like the AI tools or AI as a whole or things like that. And you can go pick those up. And yeah, the current technology or the state of the art there will change. But if you understand the context now, then you can work off the context. It gives you enough of a baseline to where you're ahead of the game later. And so like right now we're doing our book club, topenddevs.com/book club. We're doing it on AI and it talks us through AI tools and algorithms and things like that. Right. And, all the examples are in Python. Top End Devs, we don't even have a Python show, right? We have an AI show, but the point is that it's going to become a highly relevant in-demand skill. And so if I have it and I understand it, or at least I understand enough of it, then I can get into an organization and either help them start it or get into an organization that's already using it, and I can move ahead with my career in that area. Or I may get into it and realize that I hate everything about AI, and so then I start looking at some of these other forward moving things, and maybe I get into infrastructure as code, or I just stick with the technology that I'm in because they're going to be using it for the next 10 years if they're using it now, because somebody's going to have to maintain that software.
Totally. I
And
mean, like how
so,
much stuff is still built on Unix?
right. And so that's the other advice that I give people is it's like, look, you don't have to be on the latest and greatest thing. You don't have to be in a place where you're trying to prove out, new technologies. You don't have to invent anything. And so, yeah, understand the forward moving, forward thinking stuff. But if that's not your cup of tea, then there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that you're highly relevant then in the area you want to be in.
I think that's really good advice. And I appreciate the parallels between the way that you're thinking about an individual's career and how a company thinks. If I'm a CTO and I'm looking at, how am I apportioning my resources across my entire team, probably 10% of that hopefully is going to be innovation, right? Maybe more,
Hmm.
maybe, only 5% if we have a high keeping the lights on budget. But hopefully you've got a percentage that's moving forward. You've got 50% on new features, however, your team's
Right.
set up. But you're going to want to keep something aside to say, okay, what's the crazy thing we need to learn? What's the next step? And I think
Mhm.
you're kind of applying that approach that many companies take to an individual's career and saying, okay, yes, you need to kind of keep the lights on with your job. You need to do well at that. But you also need to think about what's next and really map out maybe not your next step directly, but the next learning opportunity for you so that you can reach that next stage, presuming that you want to
Mhm.
continue to grow and kind of stay relevant or even get ahead.
Yeah. The other thing that I would add is that sometimes the step forward is not the up and coming technology. Sometimes the step forward is being the team lead,
Yeah,
being middle management, being a CTO, starting your own startup, being a tech influencer with a podcast or a YouTube channel, speaking at conferences, being a dev evangelist. I mean, all of these other things are kind of non-standard track fare that make a lot of sense. Or, being an application engineer, or not engineer, an architect, right? And so that their job really is to go look at these new technologies and see how they fit. And so, um, yeah, if you're looking at your career, there are a lot of different ways you can go that aren't the standard. I'm just going to be a better, faster, more relevant dev. And so I encourage people to explore them all. The other thing is that, you're talking about companies, looking at it and going, hey, 5%, 10% innovation, things like that. But the thing is that if you really think about the way that they operate, it's not the CTO coming up with this in a vacuum, right?
totally.
What's happening is they're talking with the CEO, they're talking with the chief marketing officer, they're talking to customers, probably they're talking to a whole bunch of other people, they're talking to people in the industry, they're talking to their competitors, and what they're doing is they're formulating all this stuff, and they're trying to read the tea leaves and say what's coming and how do we profit by it, right? I've worked at some companies where they think they can maintain the status quo and stay relevant. Most of them are wrong
It's a
about that,
rarity. Yeah,
but um, the reality is that, yeah, the ones that are really forward thinking and are moving in the right direction, that's what they're doing. And so if you're doing the same kind of thing, then you can stay relevant, stay on the radar, and you can also then have these conversations with the people who are trying to make those decisions and help influence the direction that they go in. And a lot of times you wind up getting paid to learn this stuff, which
totally.
is really fun.
I love that insight because I think it's something I'll say I've experienced in my own career is like looking forward and saying, okay, I have a vision for the future. I'm interacting with others who have that vision. I'm trying to understand it. It's been a huge career differentiator for me, both in my individual contributor skills and as a team leader. So, great advice. Definitely echo that. I'm curious as you start to coach someone on this, there's a plethora of programming languages
Mhm.
available, technologies available. There's platform engineering, there's AI, all these areas you go into. How should an engineer evaluate and determine which, new skill set, new language, or kind of new area, maybe team leadership, they should actually go into based on their long-term career goals and the evolving landscape?
So I have some kind of non-traditional advice with this. I'm going to start with kind of the low-hanging fruit though, and then I'll move into that. Um, so the way that I recommend people do this is, first, you want to look at what that actually looks like for you, right? Because ultimately you want to optimize for happiness. That's what I'm telling people, right? At the end of the day, you can get a job that pays you really well to work in tech, right?
Love that.
So
Yeah,
what you're looking at, you're probably looking at, hey, I can probably get paid a little more at some company out there to do whatever, a wide range of things, right? And I've been doing Ruby for what, 16, 17 years, right? But if I went to another company tomorrow and said, I've never written more than a few lines of Python, and they were looking for an experienced developer to write Python, they may still hire me just based on the fact that I have enough experience to where I could probably pick things up more quickly than, say, somebody with a few years experience who's been doing Python for a year or two, right? There's a trade-off with what you get out of that. And so um, you're kind of in a flexible place, right? Where if you go out and you make some effort, right? Even if they wouldn't hire me just not having written any Python, I could probably get myself to a proficiency level that they'd be comfortable with within a
totally.
few months. So if you're really looking at, okay, where do I go from here and how do I get there? Go try it, right? Go try writing whatever it is, right? If you want to move into AI, go pick up a book, go watch some videos on YouTube, go uh, talk to people who are doing AI. Um, I keep saying AI, but most of the time we're talking about machine learning and machine learning algorithms. But so then you do that work, right? And you can figure out, okay, this is what that job looks like. This is what this kind of
Do I
relation
want
to other
this?
developers is. Here's what I've got to learn. Here's what I've got to know, right? So that I can show up to an interview and I can have a good showing. And in the course of that, you may figure out, like I said before, this isn't the thing for me, right? And so then you can move on to something else because a lot of these skills are transferable. But yeah, talking to people. So my hack for talking to people is starting a podcast. That's where you get
Mm,
to the non-traditional stuff, right? Is
works
that
for me.
I can turn around and I can say, okay, in fact, I'm going to do this next week. I'm starting a Python podcast, right? And
What's the name going to be, just so our listeners can know?
I don't know if I've named it yet. I'm also starting a game development podcast for the same reason. So I do have the game dev domain. I just don't have it right in front of me. But yeah, so I have a really good friend that has a game development course, right? And so I'm just going to go through his course and make him help me pick up
That's
game
awesome.
dev, right?
Yeah.
But I met him through the podcasts, and I fully intend to. He's totally willing, right? And what I found is most people, um, especially if they have a course to sell or something like that, they're willing to come on a podcast, no matter how big your listenership is. And so then you can actually ask them your questions. And that's so, yeah, every month he's going to come on and I'm going to ask him my questions. Right. And then, the point is then I can go to other people. Right. So, most of his development has been, he worked for some, big game companies like Blizzard and, right. And so his has all been on computer games. Right. But let's say I decide I want to build VR games. Well, he can get me to a certain point, but then I can go find the people who are experts in writing VR games, right? Now that I've done some stuff with Unity or whatever, and I can bring them in. And then let's say that, yeah, I figure out, you know what? Game development is not my thing. Well, there's nothing that says that you have to keep doing that podcast. Just start another one doing something else, right? And the thing is that early on in my career, and this is the other hack, okay, is that so early on in my career, I started doing a podcast about Ruby on Rails. And when I started the podcast, I wasn't actually a working programmer. I was working tech support for a company that did online backup software. And I had just taught myself enough Ruby on Rails to be dangerous. And so when I actually started the show, I just got people on from the community. And what was funny was that they were all totally willing to come, even though I was brand new and I was going to ask brand new developer questions and all that. And so by the time I needed to get that job, I had a whole bunch of contacts in the community. I started going to the meetups and I had a whole bunch of contacts in the local community. And so that worked. But then what's funny is so I worked that first programming job for a year, and the contract I was working, the money dried up, and I'm not going to get into all the details there. But I got called into the general manager's office and he said, the contract is over. We're going to have you interview for this other company. The other company didn't want to hire me because I was brand new. They took one look at my resume and said, this is too short. No. And so they laid me off. And I went and started applying. I showed up at home. Incidentally, it was like our 4th wedding anniversary. Went home, right? 2 kids at home. My wife's at home with the kids. She's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I don't have a job anymore. Right.
That's a tough day.
And so, I put my resume out there to a bunch of companies. I got a phone call from a company and they're like, hey, do you want to come in for an interview? I went in for the interview. One thing that came off the podcast was one of my friends that started a screencast series. And so I was making screencasts on how to do stuff in Ruby on Rails. And I walked out of there. The guy went and looked at the videos that I had put out and then listened to one of the podcasts. I got a call like 10 minutes after I had left. And he's like, when can you start? And I'm like, tomorrow. Right.
That's
So I
awesome.
was unemployed for like 5 hours. And so that's the other thing that this does is it not just gives you the opportunity to reach out to people and say, hey, do you want to come talk on my podcast? I have questions about this and this and this. But it puts what is it? Like a body of work out there that people can look at and say, okay, he's been doing this for a year or two. And so he obviously knows enough to be dangerous, right? To get stuff done. And that was all it took. And they made me a team lead like 2 months after they hired me. and I had a year's worth of programming experience. And the reason was because they already had context for what I knew, and they knew that I was driven to learn more stuff.
And your
And
ability to
so,
communicate it too.
right. And so it's a long-winded answer, but at the end of the day, what you need to be doing is you need to be building your skills, you build your network, and you need to build your personal brand. And I did that by writing code and then getting people on the podcast that I could ask questions of that helped me build my skills, but also helped me build my network. And having that stuff out there built my personal brand to the point where people just hired me. And that's what Top End Devs incidentally is about doing those three things. And I'm putting together a program that helps you do it. But that's it, right? And so if you start a podcast, you get it going, you start talking to people, you build your network, you get some word of mouth out there. Most of the people I talk to that start a podcast, they wind up with a few hundred people listening to it within a few weeks. And that's enough, right? And then from there, you go to the meetups and you talk to people and get some of the local folks on your podcast, and then they tell the other local folks, right? You get some of the big names out there, and then you share it on social media, and they share it on social media, and then and so it just keeps coming back to you, and that puts you in a position to very quickly move from where you're at to where you want to wind up.
And I
And
think it's a great example, but I also think there's other opportunities too, right? Like some
yeah,
folks take this approach with open source projects where they're like, hey, like
hmm
I have this idea, like maybe I'm not as comfortable on camera or, over in front of a microphone, but I can help start an open source community, or I want to get really
right,
involved as a maintainer. It's the same thing. You're showing your body of work, you're codifying your skills,
yes,
demonstrating it, and building that network to your point.
yeah, or speaking at conferences is another version of this, right?
Absolutely.
And all of those things go really, really well to help out. The trick is that with so speaking on stage, they typically post the videos and stuff like that, right? So you can share it, and people like your talk. You can have it go somewhat viral within the
That
community,
personal brand point you
right?
mentioned.
The open source is a little harder, and the reason is because it's not something that people will go consume and then come back and say, "Who did this?" Right?
Right.
If you're the owner of the project and it becomes widely used, then you have a personal brand that people will care about. But if you're one of the contributors that's, you know, is downstream two or three people, it's a little bit harder to get seen. That's not to say that it doesn't work,
Yeah, it's not
but
bad to your GitHub profile kind of thing, but
yeah. Well, and what you really want to do then is when you make a contribution, you put in a PR, maybe you get a commit bit and you're just pushing code in. If you share out what you're working on, a lot of times you can get the project owner to retweet it or whatever.
yeah,
And you can build it up that way. And then maybe you're not comfortable being on a podcast every week, but you can go onto a podcast, say, hey, I built this feature into this thing. And then you can parlay that into some of the publicity that's going to help you build
totally.
your personal brand that way.
Yeah, that term of building in public that people have probably heard more and more over the last
Yeah.
few years as, the internet has exploded and social media has become so important. Like, I know folks have trouble sometimes with kind of wanting to keep themselves out of the spotlight, but with certain parts of this and with your career, it can be so valuable to do a little building in public at least, because
Yeah.
the return for you in networking and in when you apply for a job, if someone Googles you and they're like, oh, this person is on this podcast as an expert, absolutely, that's invaluable to you.
Yeah. One other thing I'll add to that, and this is something I picked up at Podcast Movement, and I haven't actually done it for myself yet, but somebody told me to, and I own the domain charlesmaxwood.com, is to set up, right? So I have top end devs, and in a lot of ways, I am top end devs. I mean, we have co hosts on all the other shows, but having that personal brand web page that says, hey, this is what I've worked on, this is what I've done, and it's not your CV or your resume. It really is a place for people to come and find out how to connect with you and how to
Yeah.
evaluate what you've done.
So that's great advice. I appreciate you sharing it with our audience because I know there's engineers who are listening who want to take that next step. And our audience is interesting, right? Because it's a lot of senior leaders who are like, "Hey, I'm building my brand. I've kind of started this
Right.
work, or I've been doing it for a while." But we also have a lot of folks whenever we do surveys who are like, "Hey, I'm a software engineer, and I'm trying to figure out how do I take the next step in my career? How do I get to be a leader?" And so I love that you're bringing that framework to us and kind of thinking it through. I want to switch gears a little bit
Can I
here.
add one more
Oh
thing
yeah,
real quick?
please.
So on your personal website, I have people come to me and they're like, well, GitHub is basically my resume and my website. The problem is that if you're prolific on GitHub, so I'm on like 50 or 60 projects on GitHub, right? So my personal website, I put the most important stuff above the fold. And
Right.
the reason is because then if somebody needs to come and see who I am or what I've done, then I'm basically giving them a roadmap to my GitHub, if that makes sense. And I share the podcasts and stuff too, right? So here's a roadmap to here's me being an expert on Ruby, me being an expert on JavaScript, and then here's my contributions that are the most relevant to people who are going to want to come check me out on GitHub.
Makes total sense. So, obviously you're the host of your own podcast, multiple podcasts. Um, how have you seen the narrative around software development change? I think that's the last thing I really want to dive into because, we're talking about this career development, how important it is. Even just in my time in the industry, it's clear the importance of what we're doing has become so central
Right.
worldwide. What do you see happening around that perception level of the work we do, and as we try to all grow within it?
Right. Well, most of the conversations that we have on the shows are sort of internal to the communities that we're serving, right? So, as far as outside perspective, I don't know that that really changes a whole lot other than that maybe people perceive whether or not that they can come into the industry different, right? We see a lot more uh different kinds of people coming in. We see people from countries that we didn't really see them from before, right? As those countries have become more wealthy or that technology has become more democratized, which is always fun, right? So it's fun to talk to
Absolutely.
somebody from the middle of Africa that 10 years ago we just wouldn't have had a conversation with them because they weren't there. Um, but internal to programming, so there are a couple of changes, and some of them I like, and some of them I don't. Um, I think one of the biggest changes as far as how we talk about things is, again, we're taking ownership of a lot more pieces of the stack than we did before, right? So way back in the day, I was writing a Ruby on Rails app. I would deploy it to a VPS or a bare metal server, and right, I would just run everything on that, and that was kind of the way it went. And my coworkers would contribute to the same thing, and we would just run it, right. And then, um, yeah, that's how old I am. I've actually deployed to bare metal servers. So the cloud changed a lot of things, and there were two major changes that it made. One was that all of a sudden infrastructure wasn't, hey, we're going to wait for the server to get delivered to the data center.
Right.
Which, incidentally, when I was in college, I was setting up those servers. Right,
Oh,
that
yeah.
was my job, was provisioning servers. Initially, it was waiting for swapping install disks, and then we we got fancy and did a network boot to install drive, and then eventually we were using VMware, and then I graduated. Right, and so VMware was okay. We've got the bare metal. We got to make sure that VMware's on it, but then I could provision 8, 10, however many servers on it. Right. And so the cloud changed a lot of things because, yeah, if I needed another one, I could just spin it up. And setting up load balancers between them became trivial because it was almost a service more than another server.
Right.
And so that's changed. And a lot of the infrastructure is code. I mean, all the way back from Chef and Puppet, all the way up to, some of the orchestration systems we have now. I mean, you can scale into just about anything. And then we got platform as a service kind of things like Heroku, which changed a lot more things. This is in the web development space. But the other thing is then mobile came into the picture. And
Game
I
changer
remember,
worldwide.
and that changed things too, right? So now we're talking about, well, how does this perform on mobile, right? And that could be a mobile app, or it could be a web app, or it could be something that kind of straddles the line. And by that, I mean both um, web apps that have hardware capabilities, right? So you do web Bluetooth or whatever. Or the other way, and this is actually more common than you would think, is a lot of mobile apps incorporate web, in a web frame that it serves up because it's easier to do the UI in web than it is to do it with native UI elements, right?
Yeah.
And then it just talks over a JavaScript bridge and does the thing you want. Um, and you do that both in Swift apps and in things like React Native. Um, so that's changed, and then so you couple it together now, and it's okay. Well, I've got functionality on my mobile that has to talk to stuff in the cloud, and it's not just stuff in the cloud anymore, right? Because initially cloud was servers and data, and now it's servers and data and services, right? So now they provide all these services. And a lot of times what we're seeing today is we're seeing applications that have a bunch of cloud services that they rely on in order to get their work done. And so they become more complicated and more capable. And so the conversations around a lot of that stuff has changed. And so anyway, it's just kind of been this steady progression, right? And so that's why I'm seeing, okay, well, we're starting to see cloud AI services, and we're starting to see some of these
Definitely
other
coming.
things come into play. Better ways of orchestrating our infrastructure so we don't have to think about it. Different ways of checking our code to make sure that it's going to run properly through CI/CD. So anyway, so all of those things are changing the conversation, and it's really easy to fall behind on a lot of that stuff because the other stuff still works, and a lot of the companies that are out there don't want to invest in the new thing because they have other priorities that make them money, where moving to the latest and greatest platform as a service, it doesn't save them a whole lot of money. It doesn't really impact their performance. And so there's no real benefit to it, right? But then they fall so far behind that then it's a major effort to get caught up. And so that's the other thing that's changed over the last few years is the way we talk about legacy code and legacy apps.
Chuck, I really appreciate you sharing all these insights from your time and your own experiences with our audience. I know they're going to find it especially interesting. I'd love to kind of wrap up the conversation with something you mentioned, which is that you've seen this incredible boon of access to developers all over the world. And I know that you've had incredible conversations with devs, engineering leaders worldwide. Is there a particularly impactful story or profound interview that you've done that you could maybe share a little bit about for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, there are a couple of them that kind of come to mind. Most of them are from a few years back, and the reason that they come from a few years back is because it's easier to see the impact as you go.
Totally.
So I'm going to talk about two of them, and then I may mention one or two others that you can go
Perfect.
listen to and kind of think about. So the first one is um, we had the late Jim Wyrick on our show on Ruby Rogues, and we had him on and we talked about the solid principles, which were coined by Bob Martin, Uncle Bob. And he was talking about how those apply to Ruby. And we had him on the show. We had just a terrific conversation about it. And probably for the next year or two, there was an ongoing conversation about how we arranged our code based on the solid principles that came out of that. And a lot of code got a lot of cleanup and a lot of help. Just thinking about, oh, if I apply this principle to my code, it makes all of these things easier, right? And at the same time, it was writing the code in this way sometimes is challenging. And that was all part of the legacy I think that he had with the Ruby community, among other things. He contributed a lot of things to Ruby, a lot of utilities that we still use, right? But yeah, that was one that, I mean, we saw massive change in the way that people approach software, just based off of that episode. Another one that comes to mind, and this one is, I'm going to give you three examples because
Let's do
the
it.
other one's kind of
Everything's better in
interesting.
threes.
So the second example I'm going to give you though is we interviewed Brendan Ike, who created JavaScript,
Mm.
and we talked to him for like 2 hours, and he just kind of laid out where JavaScript came from and what influenced him and what the story was and where it was headed and all of this stuff, right? Um, and this was This was after he'd left Mozilla and he'd founded Brave. Um, but anyway, just so many people appreciated just understanding the history of where JavaScript came from and understanding, okay, this is why it works the way it works. And, just connecting those dots for people and making them feel like they were part of the crowd, it made a huge difference. And um, he to this day still tells people to go listen to that episode,
That's
right?
fantastic.
The last one that I want to talk about is, and this one's funny because it was one that we just recorded ourselves, right? So the first two we had well-known guests. The last one, we had Katrina Owen kind of took the lead on this. It was also a Ruby Rogues episode. It is by far our most listened to episode, and it's how to learn. It's about how to learn. And it's just, we talk through learning strategies, and people still just come to it as this, okay, how do I figure this stuff out? Right. And in an hour, she very succinctly, breaks down learning strategies for programmers. And this is an episode that we recorded like 8 years ago.
Wow.
And, people just love it. And, she went on to found Exorcism, which is an exercise, coding exercises driven by tests. And they've got like a zillion languages that you can go learn programming concepts on, and things like that. Right. So she's gone on to do a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah, I can't even measure the impact of that. And I have people reach out to me still and let me know that that one was one of their favorites. And it was because they kind of got stuck and it helped them kind of get unstuck. And so,
That's impact right there.
yeah. And some of the stories are, that's essentially all the story I get. And some of the stories are, I was in a really bad place, personally and professionally, right? You know, basically borderline abusive work situation. And I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to get out. And I picked up this episode and it encouraged me to go learn certain concepts. And I was able to move on to a better position. And boy, if there's anything that just makes me sad, it's seeing people who come into this industry and just feel like there's nowhere for them to go. And so seeing people have the opportunity to come out of that and really, um, pick it up and see what the possibilities are. I just can't say enough how lucky we are to be in this industry. There's so many opportunities. And even with the hiring slowdown that we saw over the last year and a half, it's starting to speed up back up now. Where people weren't sure that they could move jobs or anything else. Um, just helping people see, hey, there is a possibility here for you to be happy and to get paid what you need to get paid and do what you need to do and be happy in the work you're doing. Holy cow. I can't express how disempowering it is to feel stuck and how empowering it is to all of a sudden see the opportunities that are out there for you. And so, just having that open up, right? Back to the Brendan Ike story. He was just a guy working on, what was it? Netscape? Yeah,
I
Netscape.
think so. Yeah.
Right. And he was just a programmer dude. Right. And his work just happened to be the one that took off. Right. And so to tell people, hey, look, you can do this too. Right. Talk to Jim Wyrick about his story. Right. You can do this too. And that's the other piece to it is here's how you learn what you need to learn. But none of this is out of your reach if you're willing to figure out what it takes and then to do the work.
Well, Chuck, you've got me fired up to go learn something new. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights and having this conversation. Before we go, I just want to ask, what can we tell our listeners about what you're up to and where they can go learn more about what you're doing at Top End Devs?
Right. So if you go to topenddevs/dev interrupted, I'll have a page up there where you can join our newsletter and it'll explain what we have to offer. I'm not going to make a hard sales pitch on here. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to provide people the opportunities to get to know each other. I want to teach you the skills you need to learn. and, help you build that personal brand. And I'm putting together courses and meetups and having experts come talk to us if you're a member and stuff like that. But yeah, just go to topenddev/dev interrupted and we'll have basically a way for you to sign up. And if nothing else, just get on the newsletter so I can give you ideas on how you can grow and learn and, move ahead because, more than the money, I mean, the money is nice because then I can buy clothes for my kids, but, and they do like to eat. I have
Yeah.
teenagers. They like to eat a lot.
Oh, yeah. You're in for it. Yeah.
But, at the end of the day, if you're stuck, it really hurts. It hurts deep down inside me. I feel that because I've been there. Right. And it's been in my career, my personal life. I've been down in that hole. And if I can help pull you out, let me help pull you out. Right. I often do free coaching for people that are stuck. Right. And so, if you go and you join the newsletter, yeah, periodically I send an email out. Just, hey, look, I want to know where people are at. Here's how you get on the free coaching. And then, yeah, if you join the membership, then we'll give you all kinds of resources. But
Fantastic. Well,
oh
that's
my
top end
gosh,
dev slash
don't
dev
be
interrupted.
stuck.
Don't be stuck.
Yeah.
I love it, Chuck. Thank you so much for the time today. Definitely check out if you've listened to this episode all the way through. You haven't already pulled up top end dev slash dev interrupted in your mobile browser or on your computer. Make sure you do it. I think it's a fantastic mission of what you're doing, and I'm really excited to listen to these new shows you're coming out with. That's it for
All
the
right.
episode, folks. If you want to stay up to date on all things Dev Interrupted, you can also check us out on social media or subscribe to our Substack, devinterrupted.substack.com. And we're active on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find episode highlights, event updates, and more. Definitely check out Chuck's as well. You can find him at Charles Max Wood. And if you want to contribute to our Substack, we're also looking for guest authors for our 2024 season. So reach out, let us know, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, Chuck.
Yeah. Thanks.